All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. Well, now hold on. I haven't said anything yet. It's very kind of you, but I do appreciate it. But you're setting me up for a difficult task here, which is living up to your applause. So today we're going to be talking about Antietam, which of course is one of the more well-studied battles of the Civil War. So this is a program we originally did back in 2012 for the 150th anniversary of Antietam, but because Antietam took place in the month of September, this is a perfect time to resurrect this talk and look again at this very, very bloody and very important battle. So like we always do, we want to kind of set the stage for you a little bit. And I guess I should also say, unfortunately, and you'll see on the title slide here, you know where I come from, right down the street. I like to try to rewrite the history of battles to make James Garfield the hero of all of the battles of the Civil War. But unfortunately, in reality, James Garfield was not at Antietam. In fact, during September of 1862, Garfield was in Washington, D.C., basically kind of waiting for some orders. So, you know, the Army had put him on a couple of court-martials and things like that, but he really was there just kind of waiting to get orders for his next assignment. So he was not at Antietam. As much as I would like to rewrite history and have him, you know, fly in an F-16 or something and save the Union, that didn't happen. So I do have to say Garfield, unfortunately, was not involved in the Battle of Antietam. But to set the stage before we actually get to the battle on September 16th or September 17th rather of 1862. So the war in 1862, we're well into the second year of the war here. The war, of course, began in April of 1861. So by September of 1862, publicly at least in the North, the war is still about saving the Union. Lincoln has very recently written to Horace Greeley, Horace Greeley's newspaper in New York City, saying, you know, my primary objective here is to save the Union. I would do that by freeing all of the slaves, by freeing none of the slaves, or by freeing some of the slaves and leaving others alone. So publicly, at least, Lincoln is still proclaiming that the war is about preserving the Union, keeping the Union together. As he says these things, he actually has the Emancipation Proclamation in his desk drawer. So Lincoln has long since come to the realization that the Union really can't try to put the country back together and continue to have slavery intact in the South. So Lincoln is already thinking that, you know, something's got to be done about slavery. But at this point, prior to Antietam, he hasn't said so publicly yet. He has said so privately, but he's not said so publicly yet. So in the Eastern theater of the war, around, you know, primarily in Virginia, the war has not gone well for the Union. A lot of defeats. You know, the South has looked very almost invincible, really, to people in the North. In the West, however, the Union has been doing really pretty well since the beginning of the war. And you see on the screen here some of those early victories in the Western theater of the war. Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and a guy named Ulysses S. Grant was involved in all of these victories for the North. So guys like Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, and even James Garfield, in fact, are fighting in the Western theater of the war, not in the East. So while the Union struggles in the East, the Union does really very well almost from the beginning of the war in the West. There are a number of federal offensives into the South in the summer of 1862. The most famous of those is, of course, the Peninsula Campaign, which was led by Union General George McClellan. This is McClellan basically coming up with this rather elaborate plan to move Union troops down the Virginia Peninsula, land them inland, and then march across Virginia to Richmond. The idea there being that capturing Richmond will decapitate the Confederacy and the war will be over. Not everybody agrees with that, by the way. One of the people that really doesn't feel that way is Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln says, you know, Richmond is almost a secondary concern. If the Confederacy still has armies in the field, that's got to be our objective. Because we can capture Richmond all day long, but if Confederate armies are still able to maneuver and fight, then we haven't really won the war. And guys like Grant and Sherman and Garfield as well will come to agree with that perspective and eventually will not worry so much about capturing Richmond as they do defeating Confederate armies in the field. June 1st, 1862 is when we begin sort of the rise to fame of Robert E. Lee. Lee had certainly been involved in the war up to this point, but was not yet the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, this position from which he would become extremely famous and extremely revered, not only in the South, but really in American history as well. Lee is a West Point graduate, had served well over 30 years in federal service in the U.S. Army, including in the Mexican-American War, was the superintendent of West Point for a while, and then prior to resigning and leaving the Army to go back to Virginia, he was actually offered command of Union forces by General Winfield Scott, who was the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army at that point, and Lee turned that down, saying he couldn't fight against Virginia. At this point, Virginia had not quite yet, or maybe had seceded at this point, but was really just kind of at the beginning of joining the Confederacy. So Lee said he couldn't raise his sword against his home state, and so he resigned from the Army, left and went back to Virginia, and then eventually accepts command of Virginia State Forces, and then for a time is the military advisor to Jefferson Davis for the first year or so of the war. The reason Lee assumes command of the Army of Northern Virginia on June 1st, 1862 is because the previous commander, Joseph Johnston, was wounded during one of the fights close to Richmond during McClellan's Peninsula campaign. So Lee really kind of comes in and replaces Johnston after Johnston is wounded. A lot of people probably figured Lee is going to sort of keep the seat warm for Johnston while he recovers from his wound, and then when Johnston comes back, Lee will perhaps go back to Richmond and continue advising Jefferson Davis. Obviously, that's not what happened. Lee remained in command of the Army of Northern Virginia until the end of the Civil War. So here's kind of where we're starting and how we eventually end up with the Battle of Antietam on September 17th, 1862. The 7 days battles around Richmond were basically the Confederates fighting to defend Richmond from McClellan's Peninsula campaign. John Pope and the Union Army of Virginia was kind of a short-lived Union Army that eventually was kind of rolled into the Army of the Potomac. Pope and the Army of Virginia is the federal force that fought the Confederates at Second Manassas. So you recall, of course, the first really major battle of the war was First Manassas in July of 1861. And then we have the Battle of Second Manassas, really right in the same area, in fact, on some of the same fields, in August of 1862. Both of these are Confederate victories. So both of the battles of Manassas, first and second in 1861 and 1862, end up as Confederate victories. And especially that Battle of Second Manassas really starts to lead to Lee and to the Army of Northern Virginia feeling like almost invincible. I mean, they're really starting to feel like, they can whip the Union forces almost any time they want. Lee is consistently outnumbered. He consistently goes against everything he was taught at West Point and everything he was taught in 30 years in the U.S. Army. He divides his forces, and he really is very audacious, and he's very aggressive too. Lee is an offensive-minded general, and of course, if you've been to our talks on Gettysburg, you know how that ended up kind of affecting Lee's decision-making at Gettysburg, this desire to be an offensive general, to attack rather than wait to be attacked. But up until this point, it served him very well, and Second Manassas was a great example of that. So Lee is feeling very confident in himself and in his army. He's got a lot of momentum after the victory at Second Manassas, and he believes that it's now time to start taking the war up to the north. He wants to move into Maryland, and no telling where the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia would stop, simply because, again, they didn't know what kind of resistance they were going to run into, and even if they did run into resistance, again, they were very confident because of the success that they had had so far. So Lee is really hoping to take the war into the north for a number of reasons, but he's already thinking if he can win a significant victory in the north, on northern ground, then it's possible that the war would end. He was thinking the same thing, almost a year later at Gettysburg, that, a really significant Confederate victory on northern territory would perhaps convince the Union that it was kind of pointless to continue to resist, and they would the Union would sue for peace. That obviously didn't happen, but at the time it seemed like it was not that far-fetched. So in early September of 1862, Lee starts moving his army north into Maryland. So Maryland is interesting. It's one of the 4 border states in the Civil War. The border states are Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and Kentucky. These are states that have slavery within their borders, and a lot of them really do tend to maybe have a lot of Southern sympathies, but they have not seceded, and they have not joined the Confederacy. So they're considered border states. And Lee wants to move into Maryland, one, because it's considered both Northern territory, but also fairly friendly ground for Confederates. There's a lot of Confederate sympathizers in Maryland. So Lee is hoping that one thing he can accomplish here is to move into Maryland and encourage Maryland to secede and formally join the Confederacy. Maryland and Delaware and Missouri and Kentucky are those 4 border states that supplied troops to both sides of the conflict. Believe it or not, there were actually Southerners fighting under Delaware's flag during the Civil War. Not many, but there were a few. And then Maryland and Kentucky and Missouri certainly provided a fair number of troops to both sides. So Lee is hoping to get into Maryland and encourage Maryland to finally make the decision to withdraw from the Union and join the Confederacy. Lee also realizes that people in the North are getting tired of this war, primarily because they're losing. And they're reading these long casualty lists in the newspapers, and they're losing battles, and they don't see any progress being made to bring the Union back together. So Lee wants to capitalize on that, understandably so. Lee also knows that Washington, D.C. is vulnerable to a point. There are a lot of very demoralized Union troops around D.C. There are a lot of new soldiers that when they come to D.C. to sort of figure out where they're going to be sent to fight, a lot of times they end up getting thrown into the defenses of the capital city. So Lee knows that there are a lot of demoralized troops, and there are also a lot of very fresh, inexperienced troops. So taking Washington, maybe cutting into Maryland and then cutting over east towards Washington, D.C. is not outside the realm of possibility. So Lee is hoping to take advantage of all of these things by taking his army into Maryland in September of 1862. The Army of the Potomac and the Army of Virginia are both relatively demoralized. Confederates are sort of making moves like they may, in fact, attack Washington, and it's a very low point for not only Union forces, but I would say Union civilians, Northern civilians as well. Again, they're very concerned about how the war is going. Why have we been fighting for a year and a half and seeing all these men killed and really have nothing to show for it? So Lincoln is getting desperate. He's ready to start talking publicly about emancipation, but he can't do it quite yet. And so he comes back to George McClellan, who he'd already fired once. So he sort of fires McClellan, and then a few months later brings McClellan back and gives McClellan command of the forces around Washington, D.C. So as it says here, Lincoln's finding or looking for ways to really better define what the Union is actually fighting for, but also to get get the military upper hand on the Confederacy as well. So in July of 1862, and this is prior to that note he writes to Horace Greeley, by the way, that I referenced at the beginning, where he says, I want to save the Union. I would do it by freeing all the slaves, none of the slaves, whatever. That was in August of 62. So in July of 62, he actually talks to his cabinet about his intention of issuing an Emancipation Proclamation. And he wants to do it immediately, but he is advised by the cabinet, and he heeds this advice, that he should wait until the Federals have a military victory, because otherwise it's going to look desperate. The Emancipation Proclamation is really designed to accomplish two things. Yes, it is designed to sort of change what the war is all about for the North, to make the war about something other than just saving the Union. It's about bringing the Union back together and saving the Union, but making it better than it was before. But it's also a military measure. The Emancipation Proclamation also gives Lincoln and the federal government the authority to recruit African American men to fight in Union forces. This is a huge boon for Union forces because it's so much more manpower. Obviously, Southerners are not arming black men to fight for a Confederacy that intends to keep them in slavery. So Southerners, not until really the very end of the war do they even start considering the possibility of arming black men. And really they never do it to really any degree that I'm aware of. But Lincoln wants to not only make the war about more than just preserving the Union, but improving the Union, but also giving the Union the authority to recruit black men to serve in the Army and the Navy. So he heeds the advice of his cabinet and decides he will wait for a military victory for the Union before he announces the Emancipation Proclamation so that it doesn't look like a desperate act. And of course, he later said that he had kind of promised himself and God that if there was a Union victory, that this is what he was going to do, was to announce emancipation. So here's George McClellan, who's the commander of Union forces at the Battle of Antietam that we're going to get to here shortly. I promise we are actually going to talk about the battle at some point. He's 35 years old, so he's very young. I mean, very young for a position of this magnitude. He's a very young man, very intelligent, multilingual, a West Pointer, fought in the Mexican-American War, as did many of the officers on both sides of the Civil War that ended up in leadership positions. He was sent overseas in the 1850s to observe the Crimean War, so he had some knowledge about European styles of warfare. He left the Army for a while and was a railroad executive, and then, like a lot of former soldiers, came back to the Army when the Civil War began in 1861. And even though he was from Philadelphia, he was born in Pennsylvania, one of his first tasks during the Civil War in the early days of the war was actually commanding Ohio forces. So, I grew up in Pennsylvania, so I'm not sure how I feel about all this, but anyway. I guess I could say all you Ohioans always need Pennsylvanians to come and fix everything for you. But unfortunately, that doesn't hold up very well when you start talking about McClellan, so I guess maybe I shouldn't say that. So he did have some early successes. He fought some small battles in western Virginia, the area that is now the state of West Virginia, which was actually created during the Civil War. And then he's called to Washington by Lincoln in July of 1861. And this is when McClellan's sort of rise to fame really begins. Takes control of federal forces, launches this Peninsula campaign that I've already talked about, which is, an unmitigated disaster for the Union. McClellan is a lifelong Democrat. The Democrats, of course, at this time are, the very conservative party, and so he's very much uninterested in fighting a war to end slavery. McClellan thinks that nobody should just even talk about slavery. It's not an issue, so why should we talk about it? And he's also one of the guys who is obsessed with capturing Richmond. And that's where this whole Peninsula campaign came from, where he lands troops, he takes troops down the water and then lands them inland in Virginia and then tries to assault Richmond. And that's where we get the 7 Days battles, and that's where we get the rise of Robert E. Lee. So McClellan is eventually fired by Lincoln. He's removed, and then not long after, he's only gone for really a month or two, and then he's brought back and given command of the Army of the Potomac. So if you know anything about the Civil War, you know probably something about McClellan. He has this reputation, which is very well founded, as he was brilliant at organizing, and he was brilliant at logistics. So he could organize and get an army together very well, but then when it came time to fight, he was very hesitant. He was chronically overestimating the strength of the enemy before him. I mean, sometimes so much he was doubling or tripling the number of troops that he was telling Lincoln that were opposing him, Confederate troops that were opposing him. And he was very, very slow to action. So it was almost like he had built this army and he loved it so much that he was afraid to fight with it because he knew men were going to get killed. And that may be a little too generous to McClellan, but at any rate, that was his reputation. Brilliant at organizing, which this army definitely needed at this point, but he was very slow to put his army into action. So here's how he reorganized the army. Takes command at the beginning of September, is ordered into the field shortly thereafter to actually take the army into the field, and then shortly thereafter that is assigned to start moving north to pursue Lee. So Lee's army had started started moving into Maryland, started moving north around the 4th of September. So just a few days later here on the 7th, McClellan is ordered to basically pursue Lee's army and try to give battle to Lee's army. Here's on the right side here is how the army was organized, the corps and the various corps commanders there. The only one I'll point out here is the 12th Corps, in that Alpheus Williams didn't command the corps for very long. In fact, he was replaced. He was really just kind of, again, keeping the seat warm. And then Joseph Mansfield came along and took command of the corps on the 15th, so that's 2 days before Antietam. The 12th Corps has a brand new corps commander. So here's some of the differences between Lincoln and Republican. Lincoln's a Republican. What we would, to put it in more modern terms, the Republicans are kind of the progressives at this point. The Democrats are the conservatives. Lincoln is very interested in trying to end slavery, even though he hasn't said so publicly yet. McClellan has no interest in that at all. McClellan wants to fight a tactical war where he's moving, piece by piece, and eventually with that goal of capturing Richmond. Lincoln doesn't care as much about Richmond as he does about destroying Confederate armies in the field. We've already talked about Lincoln introducing the Emancipation Proclamation privately to the cabinet in July, and then making the decision to wait for a Union victory. McClellan on the right here, his main goals for the campaign as being ordered by Lincoln are to defend Washington, of course. So Lincoln may not care that much about Richmond, but you better believe he cares about Washington. He doesn't want Washington captured by the Confederates, obviously. Stop Lee's invasion of the North. And then McClellan has already got in the back of his mind that once he repels Lee and kicks him out of Maryland, then he will have all of this public support for another drive towards Richmond. So ultimately, that's what McClellan's goal is: stop the invasion and then undertake another invasion of Richmond. So Lee's army is moving again, starts moving into Maryland by around September 4th. They reach Frederick, probably 40 miles or so from Washington, D.C. by September 6th. Lee divides them into two large wings. The Northern Army of Northern Virginia, the Southern Army, is also uses the Corps designation. I just showed you all the Corps of the Union Army. Union Army is obviously a lot bigger. The Confederate Army rather does use the Corps designation as well. At this point, really, Lee has two very large corps. And eventually, shortly before Gettysburg, would divide it up into three corps. But at this point, he's got two corps, or two wings, as they're being called at this point. And overall, about 9 divisions of troops. He has a very successful and a very confident army, but he has a very tired army. He has an army that is ill-equipped. They're wearing old, threadbare uniforms. Many of them, their shoes are literally falling off their feet because they're in such bad shape. And they also suffer a lot of straggling in this campaign, a lot of desertion, a lot of troops just saying, I've had enough, I'm going back to Virginia or North Carolina or Tennessee or wherever, and they just kind of fade away, disappear. So straggling and also illness, for all Civil War armies, was a major concern. The other thing that happened in Maryland was, Lee was expecting that the Army of Northern Virginia would be welcomed as liberators in Maryland, and that really didn't happen. There were pockets of Southern sympathy in Maryland, but the people in Maryland were very kind of cool about really both of these armies. They really were a little nervous about having both of these huge armies operating in their state. So the people of Maryland did not welcome the Confederates quite as warmly as Lee was hoping for. Lee also, had his troops forage off the land to supplement their rations and things like that. So, and that was fairly common for Civil War armies on both sides. So at Harpers Ferry, which is actually not very far, in fact, it's this red kind of dot right here. At the time, that was actually Virginia. This is Virginia right here. That is actually now the very sort of tiny little tip of West Virginia, but at the time it was Virginia. There was a garrison of 12,000 Union troops at Harpers Ferry, and they, of course, were definitely a threat to Lee's army. Anytime you've got 12,000 soldiers moving around in on your flank or in your rear even, that's definitely considered a threat to your army. So Lee wants to neutralize that threat. And so he splits his army and basically orders A.P. Hill not A.P. Hill, Stonewall Jackson and some others to basically move towards Harpers Ferry and capture that federal garrison at Harpers Ferry. So he's, again, splitting the army into two wings, with one wing heading towards Harpers Ferry and the other wing continuing to move more north into Maryland. So Jackson's orders were to have this operation wrapped up, have Harpers Ferry captured, have that garrison taken care of by September 12th, and that did not happen. So Stonewall Jackson has a reputation as being this, extremely aggressive, very fast moving. His men called themselves the foot cavalry because they were supposedly so fast and everything. But there's a couple of times during the Civil War where Jackson moves a lot slower than Lee was hoping he would move. So I think Jackson is another Confederate that maybe needs to have their reputation reassessed a little bit, I should say. A brilliant tactician and everything, but there were a couple of times where Lee was expecting him to move a lot quicker than he did, and this is one of those times. So Lee is expecting this garrison to be completely wiped out and captured by September 12th. Jackson doesn't even get to Harpers Ferry until the 13th. So he's really at least a day and really more realistically several days behind schedule already. There were federal forces at Martinsburg, Virginia, also now West Virginia, who retreated to Harpers Ferry. So they actually grew the size of the garrison at Harpers Ferry. So now Jackson is not only behind schedule, he's facing more Union troops than he expected to as well. And they, of course, hold out a lot longer than Lee was expecting them to. So at this point, by the time September 12th and 13th come and go, the Confederate Army is still divided, even though at this point Lee was thinking it would be coming back together, and federal forces are still kind of holding out against this capture of Harpers Ferry. So by September 13th, the Federal Army's in Frederick, and again, Frederick is right here. So there's Frederick. So really not that, again, about today, if well, of course it's D.C., so you have to account for the traffic. I was going to say, if you drive from Frederick to D.C., if there's no traffic, which happens probably twice a year, you could be there in 45 minutes. It's not that long of a drive. So Frederick is very close to Washington, but with D.C. traffic, it'd probably take you, 2 or 3 hours to get there. So the Federal Army's in Frederick, and a soldier from the 27th Indiana finds in a field finds a bunch of cigars with a piece of paper wrapped around them, and of course picks up the cigars because he's interested in cigars, happens to look at the paper, and lo and behold, it's a lost copy of Robert E. Lee's marching orders for his army. So this is a case where McClellan literally had the Confederates' plans in his hands, and McClellan, even McClellan, who is renowned for being so slow, says to his staff, "Here is a paper with which if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will go home." And so McClellan really knows that Lee's army is divided and has some sense of how Lee's army plans to move. The orders are not a slam dunk for McClellan. They don't have enough information about strength, and they are somewhat outdated, so they're at least a few days old. And of course, we're talking about McClellan here, so we know he's automatically going to inflate the size of the Confederate army anyway. So McClellan issues orders based on the old information in that lost order for the Union Army to give battle on September 13th. That's not exactly what happens. In fact, 3 days before Antietam, we get the Battle of South Mountain, which is not as well known, but is actually a very, very hard and bloody fight. A guy by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes, who was from Ohio, you may have heard of him, was at South Mountain and was very severely wounded there. So he was not at Antietam because he almost lost his arm at South Mountain. Of all the presidents of the United States that served in the Civil War, he's the only one that actually got wounded in action, and that was at South Mountain. So we have really some really severe fighting around South Mountain just 3 days prior to Antietam, and you can see we've got about 5,000 casualties there, and South Mountain is a Union victory, so it's really the first time Lee has been beaten on the battlefield by Union troops. So Lee at this point decides it's not worth it. we haven't been as warmly received here as we thought we would. We've taken all these casualties. We're going to just fall back into Virginia and maybe try this again another time. But again, doesn't quite work out that way. This is the Battle of South Mountain and some of these mountain trails and gaps that they're fighting over. Turner's Gap, Fox's Gap, Frosttown Gap, and then Crampton's Gap over here. So all of these sort of individual little fights make up the Battle of South Mountain on September 14th, which again is 3 days prior to Antietam. So Jackson, going back to Jackson and the Union garrison at Harpers Ferry, Jackson surrounds the town on the 13th. Shells the town on the afternoon of the 14th and tells Lee that the town and the garrison are about to surrender. But again, Lee was expecting this whole operation to be wrapped up by the 12th, and Jackson doesn't get the surrender of Harpers Ferry until the 15th. So he's already several days behind schedule. Now that Lee knows that garrison has been taken care of, and it's not a concern to have Union troops in the rear or on the flanks anymore, he decides, okay, maybe we don't need to retreat just yet. He knows the Union Army is close, and so he decides to stay and fight it out around the town of Sharpsburg because he knows that the Union Army is moving toward his position. This is a modern look at Harpers Ferry, and if you've never been there, it's a beautiful place, and especially this time of year with it's like 87 degrees outside right now, but soon the colors will start to change, and it is a beautiful place, especially in the fall. So the Confederate Army starts to concentrate around Sharpsburg. Jackson departs from Harpers Ferry. He leaves General A.P. Hill in charge of some Confederates, a Confederate division left behind at Harpers Ferry, and the rest of Jackson's troops start heading toward Sharpsburg. And they arrive mostly on the evening of the 16th and some on the morning, very early in the morning of the 17th. Lee, of course, the red here is the Confederates, and then the blue are the Union. So you'll see more of that as we start going through these maps, which I realize are not easy to read at this size. But anyway, just keep in mind red are Confederates and blue are Union. So Lee starts forming his troops around Sharpsburg into position, and it's sort of hilly country, so he's got some spots where his men are occupying high ground, which of course is always a good thing when you're about to go into battle. And he uses Antietam Creek, which is running right through the middle here, this sort of light blue, not dark blue. Dark blue is Union, light blue is water, right through, kind of uses that almost as a moat between himself and the Union Army. So Lee is hoping to stand and give battle to the Union Army. He fully expects to defeat the Union Army because that's what usually happens, and then that will resurrect the campaign and allow him to continue through Maryland and perhaps on to threaten Washington, D.C. McClellan's army starts to gather as well, close to Sharpsburg. They start arriving on the 15th and 16th. The visibility is very bad on the morning. Everybody expected this battle to be fought on September 16th. But we know that's not what happened, and really the reason for that is one of those things that you just can't control, and that's the weather. It's very sort of misty and foggy on the morning of the 16th, so nobody can see anything, and it's not like today where we have night vision and smart bombs and all this stuff that we can fire from thousands of miles away sometimes. If you can't see on a Civil War battlefield, you really can't operate, and so both sides sort of decide to wait out the weather, and that's why we end up getting this battle on September 17th rather than September 16th. So this gives more time, of course, for both armies to concentrate and really get set into good positions prior to the battle actually beginning on the morning of the 17th. So the fight begins early on the morning of the 17th in the cornfield. How many of you have been to Antietam? So you have some sense of these places I'm talking about. That's good. A lot of you. That's good. So the fighting begins very early in the morning. It's not even fully light yet, and the fighting begins in the cornfield. And it starts with General Hooker from the Union Army, who of course later becomes the commander of the Army of the Potomac for another significant defeat at Chancellorsville. So Hooker's at this point is the commander of the First Corps, moves south and attacks the Confederate left flank. The first hour of the battle, as you can see on the screen there, sees an unbelievable 1 casualty every second. So it's extremely violent, extremely loud, extremely bloody. It's a very, very bloody battle. And the cornfield is a confusing part of the battle. It's a large cornfield, 24 acres, as you see there on the screen. And also, it's they're fighting in very tall, at this point, corn. It's almost harvest time. We're coming into the fall, and so the corn is very tall, and it's a very difficult place to see what you're shooting at or who you're shooting at. So you can see some of the casualties there. The 12th Massachusetts loses all but 110 of their men. It's also interesting to note here that when you're talking about a full Civil War regiment, say a new regiment, fully formed, everybody's healthy, you're talking about 1,000 men or so. Here's the 12th Massachusetts at this point in the war, and they can field 334 men for one of the most significant battles of the entire war. So that tells you just how much regiments on both sides had suffered, not only from combat injuries, but from desertion, from disease, from stragglers, whatever. And that really continues to be the case for much of the rest of the war in both the Eastern and Western theaters. There's another, you can see here, the 1st Texas, that's obviously a Confederate regiment, suffers about 82% casualties. So this is obviously a very, very intense, violent battle. I mentioned Joseph Mansfield before, and he's commanding the 12th Corps. So his corps advances into the battle around 7:30 in the morning. The battle at this point has been going on about an hour and a half. He's been in command of that corps for 2 days, and he is mortally wounded 20 minutes into the Corps being sent into action. So Mansfield literally commands the 12th Corps for about 2 days. Sort of like if you think about, a year later when we're talking about Gettysburg and George Meade being placed in command of the Army of the Potomac, 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg, something like that. So, not a lot of time for these guys to really get to know their commands or really even make much in the way of, establishing how they want their commands to run, and they're already being thrown into the fire here. So Lee is now starting to see where his line is weak. So he starts sending brigades from his center, where he was concentrated, out to support his left flank. So again, these are the Confederates here, so the left flank is going to be out here at this point. So Lee is now pulling units from the center and sending them out to bolster the left flank, and again does the same thing in a lot of different battles, including Gettysburg, pulling from one place to plug holes and then having to reformulate lines and things like that. It's very, very confusing. You've probably seen photos of, and those of you that have been to Antietam, you know about the Dunker Church, the little white church. I'm not sure if we have a photo in here of the Dunker Church or not. I guess we don't. The Dunker Church is very famous in photos of Antietam, still there. And you see George Greene on the Union side takes that area of the battlefield by about 8:30 in the morning. So now we've been fighting for about 2.5 hours. A lull kind of settles over the field at this point. Units are trying to pick up their wounded. They're trying to refit and figure out where they're going to go. The commanders of both armies are starting to sort of try to figure out where they need to plug holes and really trying to figure out what's going to happen next. They're also bringing up more soldiers. They're bringing up their reserves and starting to, knowing that the battle's going to continue at some point. And then that happens when the Union Second Corps starts moving. General Edwin Sumner, goes into the West Woods, another very famous name of a place associated with the Battle of Antietam. Lee is also sending troops to the West Woods, and so there's a very violent confrontation there in the West Woods. Union soldiers are basically sent out of the West Woods, so that's a victory on that part of the field for the Confederates. The Union troops lose 2,000 men in less than 30 minutes. So again, very, very bloody and violent. The rest of the Union Second Corps is kind of in confusion now. They're not sure where they're supposed to go, and they begin to turn south toward the Sunken Road. And you may also know it as Bloody Lane. Again, a very famous part of this battle. And some of you may be wondering why I'm not pointing things out on the map. And I can tell you, first of all, the map's very hard to read, and I know that. But I think it gives you a better sense when you look at this map. Doesn't this look confusing? I mean, look at all of this blue and all of this red down here. I'm sitting here with the map right in front of me, and I can't, even with my glasses on, I can't quite see everything either. But I think that just gives you some sense of, imagine being in the middle of that. And being, whether you're a private or a lieutenant or a captain or a corps commander, the incredible confusion that is reigning over a battlefield like this. Not to mention bullets and cannon and horses and just all of this noise and blood and violence around you. And again, we're talking about 1862 here. We're not talking about 2019 where units can literally talk to each other with satellite phones or radio communications. If you want to know where the next regiment down or the next corps down is, you've got to send a messenger down to try to find them. And what happens if that messenger gets killed, gets blown off their horse or something? I guess you just don't find out. So one of the reasons I'm not pointing a lot of things out here is because the map's so hard to read. But also I think it almost tells you more to see the map and just look at the utter confusion that you're feeling sitting in a library in 2019 looking at this map. Imagine what these guys are feeling in the middle of this battle in 1862. So it gets worse, obviously, as we continue to look at these maps. It just starts to, the sites of the action start to shift a little bit. Here's the town of Sharpsburg down here. The Confederates call this battle Sharpsburg because they tend to name battles after the towns where they're fought, whereas the Union troops tend to call them after the bodies of water that are close by. So Antietam Creek means Antietam for the North. The town of Sharpsburg means Sharpsburg for the Confederates. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. I don't know why I say Manassas for the Battle of Manassas instead of Bull Run, and here I say Antietam instead of Sharpsburg. I don't know. I have no explanation for that. It's just what comes naturally, I guess. So there's another example of confusion right there, I suppose. So here we are. Now we're talking about the sunken road, and we'll actually see some pictures of that at the end here. So if you're curious what I'm talking about there, how it's sunken exactly, you'll see that. But it's basically a lane that is sunken down, and troops are actually fighting in that sort of sunken down road. 2,500 Confederates in the sunken road, that's 2 brigades. 5 Union brigades attack the sunken road, and you've got the Irish. Oh, and by the way, one of our talks next year will be about the Irish Brigade, in case you're curious about that. And that will be in March, of course, because it's St. Patrick's Day in March. So if you want to know more about the Irish Brigade, mark that on your calendar to be here in March. But anyway, the Irish Brigade charges the road, takes over 500 casualties very quickly. Confederate reinforcements start to arrive, and then Union soldiers finally take the sunken road by about noon. So at this point, again, there's been fighting for about 6 hours or so, and the casualties are just piling up and piling up and piling up. So here's just a recap of sort of the northern phase, if you will. 8,000 casualties in the cornfield, 5,000 to 6,000 in the West Woods, 5,000 to 6,000 in the sunken road. So we're talking about 17,000 men killed, wounded, captured, or missing by 1 o'clock. So within about 6 or 7 hours of fighting, 17,000 casualties. And really, the positions of the armies have not changed that significantly. So there really hasn't been a whole lot of ground gained by either side here. The armies are, for the most part, in pretty much the same positions that they were prior to the battle starting. 3 Union Corps have been basically destroyed, the 1st, 2nd, and 12th. Lee has managed to hold his left flank, which is where all this action started early in the morning of the 17th. But in order to hold his left flank, he has significantly weakened his right flank. So he's been pulling troops from the center and from the right to reinforce the left. So now his left is fairly secure, but his right and his center are much weaker. And again, this happens at a lot of different Civil War battles. This is Burnsides Bridge. Or the lower bridge was it was called more commonly by the locals. Not unique at all in terms of architecture or anything like that. It's a fairly common bridge design for this part of Maryland. Obviously, this one has gone down in history because of this particular battle. It's only about 10 feet wide, so you cannot send a lot of soldiers across this bridge all at one time. And also, if you look here, you see the heights kind of around the bridge. So as Union forces are trying to assault across the bridge, Confederates are up here in on the heights firing down on them. So that obviously gives those Confederates a great advantage. This is absolutely critical position here if Union forces want to get across the creek, across Antietam Creek, they need to be able to get across across the lower bridge. And of course, it eventually becomes known as Burnsides Bridge because Burnside was the Union commander in this part of the battlefield. So the fight here begins around 9:30 in the morning. So this is going on while a lot of this other action in other parts of the field is happening as well. You can see Rodman's division is supposed to go to Snavely's Ford in conjunction with the attack on the bridge. So basically, if Rodman's division can get across, then they'll be kind of coming at it from two different sides. And then Georgians from Robert Toombs's unit are holding the bluffs around the bridge that I referred to a second ago. So we've got Union forces trying to cross the bridge, and then you've got Confederates from Georgia up here on the heights basically firing down at them. And you can see the units here that are involved in the three different attacks. It takes several hours for Union forces finally to get enough men across the bridge that they actually can take the bridge and force those Georgians off the heights around the bridge. And then the final attack begins around 3 o'clock. You've got about 8,000 Union troops moving against roughly 2,500 to 3,000 Confederates. At this point, Lee has almost all of his men there. And he's used most of his reserves at this point. So if this attack, if enough Confederates are taken out in this attack, then the battle is over for the Confederates because they've used up all of their reinforcements at this point. So they're hoping to mass their artillery, use artillery fire, and then hopefully the infantry can hold on long enough. They've got to protect the right flank from Federal attack. Remember, we said the left was secure, but the right is weak now, and so Lee is very concerned about that right flank. And then the Federal advance is really starting to hit Lee, and by about 4 o'clock, Lee is starting to think that this battle might be lost, and he's going to have to withdraw, and the battle is going to be over, and it's going to be a Union victory. But we forgot about those troops that got left behind at Harpers Ferry. So after Jackson and his men took Harpers Ferry, Jackson and the rest of his Confederates saved this division under A.P. Hill, all headed toward Sharpsburg. Hill was left behind at Harpers Ferry to kind of basically finish mopping up everything that needed to get done at Harpers Ferry. So when the battle is really at its worst, word reaches Hill that he needs to get to Sharpsburg right away. So he orders his men onto the road, and they march very quickly for about 15 miles from Harpers Ferry to Sharpsburg. And so these roughly 1,500 to 2,000 men from Hill's division show up and take the Federals by surprise and really conduct a pretty audacious and severe attack on the left flank of Burnside's Federal soldiers, the ones who had taken the bridge not too long ago. And so this is a very successful counterattack led by A.P. Hill. Later, after Stonewall Jackson gets killed at Chancellorsville, when Lee, as I mentioned earlier, divides his army up from 2 corps into 3, Hill becomes the commander of the 3rd Corps, fights at Gettysburg, and really all the way through till the end. Hill is killed on April 1st, 1865, 8 days before Lee surrenders. So Hill fights all the way through until almost the very end of the war, and then gets killed 8 days before the Army of Northern Virginia surrenders to U.S. Grant. So at this point, the war, or the battle rather, not the war, is almost over. The Federals don't launch any further assaults. McClellan had, whereas Lee had used all of his reserves, McClellan still had about 8,000 men in reserve. And it's one of those great mysteries that people are still debating even today. Why didn't McClellan commit those last 8,000 men? That could have turned the tide. But he didn't, and so he actually ended the battle with 8,000 men in reserve who'd never seen action during this battle. As it says here on the slide, he thought they needed to be held back because they were the last fresh troops between Robert E. Lee and Washington, D.C. That's a very worthy consideration, absolutely. So maybe we should give McClellan a little bit of a break on that one. But hindsight's always 20/20, isn't it? So we can say, wow, he had 8,000 men. That could have really made a huge difference. But at any rate, he did not commit those men. Everyone assumes, both sides assume, that the battle will continue the next day. The battle on the 17th concludes after about 12 hours or so of fighting. Everyone assumes it will continue the next day. Of course, we all know it doesn't. Not much happens on the 18th. Both sides are trying to pull wounded off the field and provide care for the wounded. And then by the evening of the 18th, even as McClellan thinks that, okay, the attack will resume on the 19th, Lee decides on the evening of the 18th to retreat. And so the Confederates at this point at Antietam had lost about a quarter of their strength to killed, wounded, captured, or missing. And so Lee decides, okay, it's really not a sustainable effort now to continue attacking in the north, so we need to retreat back into Virginia. And so that's what happens. Lee begins the retreat back south into Virginia. We have some, as we often do with these very large battles, we have some rearguard actions that take place as troops are retreating. In this case, September 19th and 20th at Shepherdstown, which again at the time was Virginia, is now West Virginia. So here's some of the photographs that I was mentioning. There's one of the sunken road in here shortly. So Antietam is significant for a lot of reasons, but one of them, it's the first American battlefield that was heavily photographed, really right after the battle. So these men that you see lying on the ground here are casualties from this battle. Alexander Gardner and to a degree Matthew Brady also, the two most famous Civil War era photographers, did come out and actually photograph this battlefield really right after the battle ended, to the point where some of the bodies literally were not even buried yet. And you can see Gardner arrives on the 19th. That's just 2 days after the battle. And so there was a sort of a public exhibition of photos in New York in October of 1862, and that really kind of changed a lot of people's opinion about the war too. If you think back to the way that the government was really kind of not wanting to release a lot of photos of American casualties on D-Day, for example, in World War II. They were afraid that the American public would turn against the war when it saw dead Americans lying on the beaches of Normandy. The same thing kind of happened here, where a lot of people turned against the war because now the war is being brought to them, and they're seeing not just what they read in the paper, but now they're literally seeing photos of men killed in action during a very bloody battle. Here's more, again, more photos from right after. So these are, I believe, are dead Confederates here lying along the fence. So more very famous images here from Antietam. Here's the sunken road with bodies. So you've got these two guys kind of standing there observing, but then these are bodies of Confederates in the sunken road. So you can see it literally is a sunken road. Some people refer to it as Bloody Lane. So it's, if you hear sunken road or Bloody Lane, they're talking about the same thing. And then, of course, these very famous photos, you've probably seen these before. So here's Lincoln talking to McClellan. This is maybe a month or so, I think, after the battle. This is going to be into October. So just like Lincoln was furious with Meade after Gettysburg for not pursuing Lee, because remember, Lincoln is heavily invested in Union armies destroying Confederate armies in the field. Doesn't care about capturing Richmond as much. He wants Confederate armies destroyed. So when Union troops actually win a victory, especially in the East, which up to this point at least had they'd been few and far between, Lincoln wants McClellan to pursue Lee. He wants them to chase Lee back into Virginia, fight him again until the Army of Northern Virginia is destroyed. And of course, McClellan starts telling Lincoln why he can't do that. I need more men. The Confederates still have, 1 billion men that I'm going to have to fight or whatever, because we're talking about McClellan. So he's overestimating the enemy's forces. At one point, he tells Lincoln, and this is a very famous story, but it's a good one. He tells Lincoln that he can't pursue Lee because the horses are too fatigued. And Lincoln responds rather snarkily, "Will you pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam to fatigue anything?" Meaning, why are you still waiting? Go, attack, give chase, attack. And he felt the same way almost a year later with Meade after Gettysburg. Why are you not pursuing and destroying them? So here Lincoln came to the field near Antietam to see McClellan. This is around October of 1862. Here's Lincoln with McClellan right here and some of his staff. Lincoln, obviously very, very easy to pick out. He's a head taller than everybody. McClellan was fairly compact, Lincoln very, very tall. And then so these are very famous photos of Lincoln conferring with McClellan after Antietam. So Lincoln keeps his promise. He had decided that if the Union won a victory, he was going to publicly declare the Emancipation Proclamation. He kept that promise 5 days after the battle, because the battle is considered a Union victory. Tactically, it's a draw in terms of, you know, how the armies moved on the field and who really won the field. It's a draw. But strategically, it is a victory for the Union, because the end result of the battle is Lee is retreating back into Virginia. Maryland is secure. Maryland is not going to now secede and join the Confederacy for the moment. So strategically, in the bigger picture of things, it is a Union victory, and that's enough for Lincoln. He says, that's the victory I've been waiting for, and he releases the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, telling the country that unless the Confederates lay down their arms and come back into the fold by January 1st, then after January 1st, slaves in states then in rebellion would thenceforward and forever be free. Now, how many slaves actually were freed on January 1st, 1863 in, Alabama or Mississippi? None, of course, but in a larger sense, Lincoln was telling everyone, this is now part of what we are fighting for. We're not going to let you come back and keep slavery. So the war now is taking on a much different, it's a moral crusade now really to abolish slavery as well as bring the Union back together. So the war now is being fought not to preserve the Union as it was, but to make the Union better, to make the United States live up to what it says on paper, that all men are created equal. As far as on the ground, the Antietam does result in a Union victory strategically, at least by stopping the Confederate invasion of the North and Lee retreating back into Virginia. Lee and Southerners and Northerners too start to realize that the Army of Northern Virginia can be beaten. They are not invincible, and so that's actually news to a lot of people, probably including a lot of Southerners. Leads, of course, to the Emancipation Proclamation. And in 12 hours of fighting, both sides suffer a combined 23,000 casualties, making it the single bloodiest day in American history. So 23,000 casualties in about 12 hours of fighting. And again, by the time the battle was over, tactically, the sides hadn't really changed very much. But the legacy of this battle and what this battle enabled Lincoln to do, obviously this makes it one of the most important Union victories of the entire war, if not the most important. And then these are just some good quotes from some of the soldiers that fought at Antietam. Shells are bursting around us continually. In the wild excitement of battle, I forget my fear and think only of killing as many of the foe as I can. Here's a guy that was a victim of friendly fire, Julius Robardi from the 12th Mass. I was shot through the right thigh by our own men. I was exposed to the fire of slavery and freedom, meaning he took fire from both sides. The Confederates were shooting at him, and then one of his own men ended up shooting him accidentally as well. John Hood, who was a Confederate division commander, when asked where his division was located, he said, dead on the field. So this is, again, just some powerful quotes from soldiers that fought at Antietam. So again, Antietam is a critically important battle, even though tactically it looks like not much has changed at the end of the day. Strategically, it's a Union victory, and really, if there's one thing to take away from it, really it's that this is the battle that enabled Lincoln to have the confidence to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, and that really changed what the war was all about. And a year after this battle, he goes to Gettysburg and gives the Gettysburg Address, where he talks about the new birth of freedom for everybody, and that's really what the Battle of Antietam led to, was the ability to make that a reality. So, does anyone have questions? Anything at all I can try to answer for you about Antietam?
I like that quotation from McClellan.
Oh, where's McClellan?
Middle one.
Oh, I feel some little pride in having, with a beaten and demoralized army, defeated Lee so utterly and saved the nation so completely. McClellan was very humble. Those in whose judgment I rely tell me that I fought the battle splendidly and that it was a masterpiece of art. If you ever want some entertaining reading, read the letters that McClellan wrote to his wife. He was quite an egomaniac, I guess you would say. McClellan, interestingly enough, after, around November or so after Antietam is fired, and that's it for him. He doesn't command troops again in the war. And then, of course, he resurfaces in 1864 as the Democratic presidential candidate running against Abraham Lincoln, which obviously does not win, but, and then later in life as the governor of New Jersey for a while as well.
Also, that sort of stopped the possible intervention by European powers.
Yeah, that's a great point. This quote at the bottom here from an Englishman, a member of Parliament. The Emancipation Proclamation has closed the mouths of those who have been advocating the side of the South. Recognition of the South by England, whilst it bases itself on Negro slavery, is an impossibility. So the Confederacy, from the earliest days of secession and creating the Confederacy, was obsessed with the idea of getting a foreign government to recognize them. The French, the British, one of the major European powers. And there, for a time, seemed like the British might do it because they were so reliant on Southern cotton for textiles. But as this gentleman, Richard Cobden, who was a member of Parliament, observes, the British were never going to acknowledge or formally recognize a confederacy that based itself on the institution of slavery, because the British had abolished slavery 30 years before. And a lot of Southerners knew this, and knew that they were never going to get foreign recognition, but there were a lot of others that sort of held out hope that maybe this would happen. Kind of like, when the French recognized the colonial government during the Revolutionary War, and, really we owe a lot of our independence to the French, especially the French Navy coming and helping Washington at Yorktown. The Southerners, the Confederacy in the Civil War was waiting for some kind of similar intervention by the British or the French, and it never came. Had it come, who knows how different things might have been with British ships or weapons, who knows? But no, it didn't. It did not happen. So, any other questions, comments? We'll be back here in October. And I won't lie and say I remember what the topic is, but we will be here on the second Wednesday in October. And again, if you're interested in what we're going to be doing here next year, there are copies of the next year's program list in the back there. So thanks for coming. Have a great day.